You don't belong in this family. Sterling will take care of everything. End. That was all it took. One sentence, and Harold Ashford erased his only biological daughter from his life. Not because she committed a crime, not because she betrayed anyone, but because she wasn't thin enough, wasn't pretty enough, wasn't polished enough to stand beside the second wife he valued more than his own blood. That night, Penny walked out of the Ashford mansion carrying a single suitcase, with a 62-year-old housekeeper already waiting for her at the gate. No money, no degree, no one else in the world but the two of them. But Harold didn't know that exactly 3 years later he would be sitting across from the daughter he once discarded in a negotiation room he had no power to leave. She would read every number proving his empire had collapsed. And when he called her, my daughter, she would look him straight in the eye and say, "Mr. Ashford, we're in a meeting. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so others can hear it too. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. And tell us, should Penny forgive her father? Leave your answer in the comments. 3 years earlier, the Ashford estate sat in the northern reaches of Chicago, in that quiet pocket where families with real money didn't need to show it, yet still turned heads without trying. That afternoon, Claudia had hired a photographer to come to the house and shoot a family portrait for an interview in a business magazine. She wanted everything perfect, from the angle of the living room to the exact order in which each person would stand. Penny heard the low, restless sounds from downstairs. She changed her clothes, smoothed her hair as neatly as she could, then walked down the staircase. She didn't know the dress code for the shoot, because no one had told her. But she went anyway, because it was a family photo, and she was still part of this family, or at least she believed she was. Her foot had barely touched the final step when Claudia's voice cut clean across the room. "Only 3 people. She isn't participating." Claudia spoke to the photographer without lowering her voice, the words carrying far enough that everyone in the room could hear, including Penny. The photographer looked up at Penny, then back at Claudia, uncertain, caught in that small, awkward space where he didn't know how to respond. Sterling stood beside Harold, his eyes passing over Penny for the briefest moment before returning to the camera as if nothing had happened. Harold stood upright, adjusting his collar, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't turn. He didn't say a word. Penny remained on the last step of the staircase. She didn't move forward, and she didn't go back up. She simply stood there, waiting for a voice from her father. Just one sentence. Something like, "Let the girl join," or "Penny, come here," anything at all. But Harold Ashford stayed silent. The camera began to click. 3 people stood before the lens. Claudia smiled brightly. Sterling stood tall, confident. Harold placed a hand on Sterling's shoulder. The perfect family portrait. 3 people, not 4. Penny turned and went back upstairs without anyone noticing. She sat on her bed, looking out the window, listening to the laughter drifting up from below. She was used to this feeling, used to being pushed to the edges, so used to it that sometimes she wondered whether she truly existed in this house at all. But what happened after the photo session was what made that night become Penny's final night in the Ashford estate. Around 9 o'clock that evening, when the photographer had already left and Sterling had gone upstairs, Penny walked down to the kitchen for a glass of water. She passed Harold's study and heard Claudia's voice from inside. The door was slightly ajar. "I've endured enough, Harold." Penny stopped. She hadn't meant to listen, but she couldn't walk away either. "Every time I see her, I have to explain to my friends why she looks like that. She doesn't look like me. She doesn't look like anyone in this family." Harold said something very softly, too soft for Penny to make out. Claudia continued, her voice sharper now. "You have to choose. Either she goes, or I go. I'm not going to live in a house where every day I have to look at something that reminds me you had another life before me." Then, Claudia said, the final sentence, the one Penny would remember for the rest of her life. "She looks exactly like your first wife. Every time I look at her, I see her." The study fell silent. Penny knew why those words worked so well. Her father never spoke about her biological mother. Not a single photograph of her remained in the house after the day Claudia moved in. Harold wanted to erase that past completely, and Claudia knew exactly how to turn Penny into the reminder he couldn't bear. Penny stepped away from the half-open door. She didn't go to the kitchen for water anymore. She returned to her room, sat down on the edge of her bed, and looked at her hands. Round hands, short fingers, not long and slender like Claudia's. She wondered if things would be different. If she were different. If she were thinner. If she were prettier. If she didn't resemble her mother so much. Would her father look at her even once, just once, without seeing failure? She didn't have an answer, but she knew the question itself was already the answer. 1 hour later, the phone on Penny's nightstand buzzed. A message from Harold. "Come down to my study." No question mark, no please, no choice. Penny looked at the screen for a while, then stood up. She walked down the stairs for the second time that night. This time there was no photographer, no Claudia, no Sterling. The mansion was silent. There was only the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor and the steady ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. She knocked on the study door. Harold said, "Come in a low, tired voice, like a man who had prepared a speech but didn't truly want to read it. Penny stepped inside. Harold sat behind the desk, both hands resting on the wood, his eyes lowered to the pen turning slowly between his fingers. He didn't stand. He didn't look at her. The door closed behind Penny, and the room suddenly felt much smaller. "Sit down, Penny." She sat in the chair across from him. The distance between father and daughter was only a desk, but it felt like an entire ocean. Harold drew in a long breath, then began to speak. His voice was slow, each word chosen carefully, like a man reading from a contract rather than talking to his daughter. "I think it's time for you to change your environment. Living outside for a while will be good for you. You need to learn how to be independent, need to experience life beyond this house." He continued, still turning the pen, still not looking up. "Sterling will take care of everything at the company. You don't need to concern yourself with things here anymore. I think this is a good opportunity for you to find yourself." Every sentence was wrapped in pretty paper. Opportunity, independence, finding yourself. But Penny heard clearly what was hidden beneath all those layers. Her father was sending her away. He simply didn't have the courage to use the word. Penny sat still for a while. Then she asked, her voice calmer than even she had expected. "Claudia made you say this, didn't she?" The pen in Harold's hand stopped turning. He still didn't look up. His silence was already the answer, but Penny continued. "If I were thinner, if I were prettier, if I were a son, would you still say this?" Harold opened his mouth, then closed it again. His fingers tightened around the pen until his knuckles turned white. But he didn't answer. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the true answer would turn him into something he didn't dare recognize. Penny nodded slowly. "I understand." Those 3 words were gentle, but they fell into the room heavier than any shouting could have. Harold had probably prepared himself for an argument. He had probably been ready for tears, for pleading, for anger, but he hadn't prepared himself for, "I understand," spoken in the even voice of someone who had grown so used to being abandoned that she was no longer surprised by it. Penny stood up. The chair scraped softly against the wooden floor. Harold hurried to add, his voice faster now, as if he wanted to slip something in before the door closed. "I'll send you money every month. You won't have to worry about finances. I'll arrange an apartment for you in. No need." Penny cut him off without raising her voice. 2 short words. Harold looked up for the first time since Penny had entered the room. He looked at his daughter, and for one very brief moment, something flashed in his eyes. Maybe regret, maybe shame, maybe only surprise that she wasn't crying. But the moment passed quickly. He lowered his gaze back to the pen on the desk. Penny walked to the door. Her hand closed around the doorknob, turned it gently, and pulled it open. She didn't slam it. She closed the door softly, almost without a sound, the way someone closes the door of a hospital room when the patient is asleep. Not because she was calm, but because she didn't want to give Harold Ashford the privilege of knowing he had hurt her. She didn't want to give him the feeling that she was important enough in his eyes to be angry. If he didn't see her as family, she wouldn't give him the reaction of family. The door shut. Harold sat alone in his study, the pen still caught between his fingers, but no longer turning. He didn't get up and chase after her. Penny went back up to her room. She pulled the small suitcase out from under the bed, opened it, and stood there looking around. 20 years living here, and there was nothing worth taking with her. A few sets of clothes, an old pair of shoes, the notebook she used to take notes while working for the family company. It didn't take her long to pack. The suitcase still had room left when she zipped it shut and that empty space said more than any words ever could about the 20 years Penny had spent living in this house. She pulled the suitcase down the stairs. Its wheels bumped over each wooden step, the steady clatter echoing through the silent mansion. Halfway down, she saw Sterling. He stood in the downstairs hallway, leaning against the wall, one hand holding his phone. Sterling looked up when he heard the suitcase. His eyes moved to Penny, then to the suitcase, then back to Penny. No surprise, no concern, no asking where are you going, no wait. He only looked at her the way someone might look at a delivery worker passing through the foyer, then turned his gaze back to his phone screen. His finger kept scrolling. Sterling's world wasn't affected for even 1 second. Penny walked past him. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to someone who had never considered her real enough to exist. Walking past Sterling was as easy as walking past a vase placed in the hallway. Decoration. Beautiful, exactly where it belonged, but meaningless to her. She opened the front door. The night air poured in, cold and still. Penny stepped over the threshold, pulled the suitcase down the front steps, and walked along the stone path leading to the gate. Behind her, the Ashford mansion was still lit. Inside, it was still warm, but that warmth had never been meant for her. She reached the gate and stopped. Mrs. Ruth was standing there. The 62-year-old housekeeper stood outside the iron gate, carrying a small cloth bag over her shoulder. The bag wasn't any bigger than a market bag. Her hair was tied neatly in a bun, her back slightly bent, but her eyes were clear and steady. She stood there as if she had been standing there for a long time, as if she had known exactly that Penny would walk out through this gate tonight. Penny looked at her, then at the cloth bag, then back at her. Mrs. Ruth, you don't need to. Penny hadn't finished the sentence when Mrs. Ruth shook her head. I promised your mother. Her voice didn't tremble. It wasn't sorrowful, wasn't dramatic. It was the voice of someone speaking of something obvious, like water flowing downhill, like the sun rising in the east. Before your mother died, she held my hand. She said, watch over Penny for me. It's been 20 years, Penny. I'm not breaking that promise today. Penny stood still. She didn't know what to say. For 20 years, Mrs. Ruth had been the one to wake her each morning, the one to set food aside for her every night after the family had eaten without calling her, the only one who knocked on her door and asked, have you eaten? While this entire mansion treated her like a ghost. Penny had always thought Mrs. Ruth did those things because she was kind, because she was simply that kind of person. She hadn't known that behind all of it was a promise made to someone who was gone. You'll lose your job, Penny said softly. I already told Mr. Harold. I quit, as of tonight. But where will you stay? You don't either, Mrs. Ruth said simply. So, now the two of us don't have anything together. Go. Mrs. Ruth turned and walked ahead. She didn't wait for Penny to agree. She didn't ask whether Penny wanted her to come along. She walked as if this had been decided 20 years ago, and tonight was only the day it was finally carried out. Penny looked back at the Ashford mansion one last time. The light in Harold's study was still on. Maybe he was still sitting there, turning the pen, staring into empty space. Maybe Claudia had gone to bed, satisfied that she had finally removed the one thing that made her perfect family portrait tilt out of frame. Maybe Sterling was still standing in the hallway, scrolling through his phone, already forgetting that he had just watched his sister pull a suitcase out of the house and leave. Penny turned her head back. She followed Mrs. Ruth into the night. 2 figures, one old and one young, one cloth bag and one small suitcase, walking down the empty street under the pale yellow streetlights. No one watched them go. No one called them back. Behind them, the iron gate of the Ashford mansion closed with a soft metallic click, gently. The same way Penny had closed the door to Harold's study a few minutes earlier, so gently it almost made no sound at all. So gently that the people inside would never know they had just lost the only thing that had ever truly belonged to them. Mrs. Ruth took Penny to a women's shelter on the south side of Chicago. They arrived there close to 12 o'clock that night, filled out the registration forms beneath the pale hallway lights, then were led into a shared room with 6 beds. Only a few hours earlier, Penny had been standing inside a mansion that stretched across hundreds of square meters. Now she lay on a narrow iron bed, listening to the breathing of strange women around her. Penny lay facing the wall. On the first day, she didn't eat. On the second day, she didn't speak. On the third day, she lay so still that Mrs. Ruth had to place a hand on her back to make sure she was still breathing. She didn't cry. She had used up her tears long before the night she was driven out. What Penny was going through wasn't pain. It lived somewhere deeper than pain, in the place where a person no longer had enough strength to feel anything at all. She only lay there, eyes open, staring at the white wall, letting time pass like water flowing around a stone. Mrs. Ruth didn't force her. She didn't sit beside the bed saying things like, "Everything will be fine," or "Your father will regret this." Mrs. Ruth wasn't the kind of person who said such things. She knew everything wasn't fine, and she didn't know whether Harold would regret anything. She didn't want to lie, so she stayed silent, let Penny lie there, and did the only thing she knew how to do. She went out to find work. On the morning of the fourth day, Penny woke and saw a piece of paper lying on the plastic chair beside the bed. It had been torn from a notebook, and on it was Mrs. Ruth's handwriting, slightly slanted, slightly shaky, but clear. A list of 7 places hiring, with addresses and phone numbers. Mrs. Ruth had gone and asked at every one of them during the 3 days Penny had lain motionless. Mrs. Ruth sat at the foot of the bed, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. "I don't know how to comfort people," she said, her voice as ordinary as if she were talking about the weather. "I've lived 62 years, and I still don't know how to say those words that make someone less sad. I only know how to work. So when you're done crying, read this." Penny looked at the paper. Then she looked at Mrs. Ruth. The older woman was still wearing the clothes she had worn when they left the Ashford mansion, because she had brought only a small cloth bag with her, and there probably hadn't been much inside. Her shoes were old, the heels worn down, but still clean, because Mrs. Ruth was someone who always kept things clean no matter the circumstances. Her back seemed a little more bent than it had a few days ago. Or perhaps Penny was only seeing it clearly now because before this, she had never truly looked. "You lost your job because of me," Penny said. It was the first sentence she had spoken after 3 days. Mrs. Ruth looked at her without blinking. "I lost it because I chose to. That's different." Penny fell silent. She thought about what Mrs. Ruth had just said. Losing something because it was taken from you, and losing something because you laid it down with your own hands, were 2 entirely different things. Harold had driven Penny away because he chose Claudia. Mrs. Ruth had left her job because she chose Penny. Both were losses, but one had cost a person their dignity, while the other had kept it whole. Then Penny looked at Mrs. Ruth again, and this time she truly saw her. She was 62 years old. Her back hurt. She had no home, not much savings, because she had spent her whole life working in other people's houses. She had walked out of the Ashford gates with 1 cloth bag and a 20-year-old promise, and she hadn't hesitated. She hadn't complained, hadn't asked what now, hadn't spent 3 days facing the wall. She had gone outside, walked to every diner, every shop, every small office, asked if they needed help, then written down each address in her trembling handwriting on a hastily torn sheet of paper. 62 years old, starting over from nothing. Not one word of complaint. Penny looked down at her hands. Round hands, short fingers, the hands she had wondered, only a few days earlier, if everything might have been different had they looked different. But now she thought differently. These hands were still young, still strong, still able to hold something. Mrs. Ruth was 65, and she could still stand up. Penny was 26. She didn't have the right to lie here for another day. Not for herself, but because if she stayed here, Mrs. Ruth would have to carry 1 more person, and she had already carried enough. Penny sat up, picked up the piece of paper, read the first line. Mrs. Ruth didn't smile, didn't say good girl, didn't show relief. She only gave 1 very slight nod, then stood. "The 3rd place on the list needs someone for night shift data entry. It's the closest. You can walk there." Penny folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. She placed her feet on the cold floor and stood for the first time in 3 days. Her legs trembled a little from lying down for so long, but she stayed upright. Mrs. Ruth had already walked to the door. She didn't look back. Exactly like that night, outside the mansion gate. She always walked ahead, and Penny always followed. Not because Penny was weak, but because Mrs. Ruth knew the way. The 3rd place on Mrs. Ruth's list was a small shipping company at the end of a street on the south side. Penny went there in the afternoon and met the manager, A middle-aged man who didn't ask where she had graduated from, didn't ask what experience she had, and asked only one question. "Can you handle working the night shift?" Penny nodded. She started that same evening. The work was simple. Sitting in front of a screen, entering each order, each shipping code, each number into a spreadsheet, over and over again from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. No one talked to her. No one needed her to be beautiful, to be thin, to be perfect. They only needed her to enter the numbers correctly, and Penny entered them correctly. Though she had no degree, Penny had a natural instinct for numbers that no classroom could teach. 6 months of night shift data entry taught Penny something no one had planned. She learned how to read the movement of money. Every number told her who was telling the truth and who was lying. She saw orders recorded one way while the money moved another. She saw shipping costs swell strangely at the end of the month, then shrink again at the beginning of the next. She didn't tell anyone, didn't report it, didn't complain. She only watched and remembered, not because she had any plan, but because her mind worked that way, and she looked at figures the way other people looked at words. There was a story hidden inside every spreadsheet, and Penny could read those stories. While Penny worked nights, Mrs. Ruth worked by the hour for families in the neighborhood, cleaning one house in the morning, cooking for another in the afternoon. 65 years old, her back aching whenever the weather turned cold, yet she didn't take a single day off. Every evening, when Penny left for work, Mrs. Ruth had already set food aside on the table, exactly as she used to do at the Ashford mansion. The only difference was that now she cooked with money she had earned herself, in a small kitchen the size of a corner of a bathroom in the Ashford house. Their combined income was just enough for them to leave the shelter. They rented a small studio, the kind of room where the bed stood 3 steps from the gas stove and the window looked out at the brick wall of the building across the way. But it was theirs. For the first time in her life, Penny lived in a place where no one could drive her out. In the 7th month, the shipping company manager called Penny in and told her the company was cutting night shift staff. Penny lost her job. She didn't panic. She had seen the signs 2 weeks earlier in the spreadsheets: revenue falling, orders thinning out, costs not being cut fast enough. She knew this day would come, so she had prepared for it. During those 6 months, whenever she had free time, Penny wrote down everything she had learned from the spreadsheets in the notebook she had brought from the Ashford house: how money moved, how to reconcile income and expenses, how to detect irregularities. She didn't have an accounting degree, but she had 6 months of watching money pass through her hands every night, and sometimes reality taught faster than school. She found a new job within a week: night shift cashier at a seafood restaurant in downtown Chicago. It wasn't an elegant restaurant, but it was established enough for business people to stop by for late meals after long meetings. The pay was higher than at the shipping company. More importantly, Penny got to sit at the cashier counter right in the middle of the restaurant, where she could observe how people with money talked, negotiated, and made decisions. She watched the way they shook hands, the way they looked one another in the eye when speaking about money, the way their voices changed when they moved from small talk to business. She remembered all of it, not because she wanted to become them, but because she wanted to understand the world her father lived in, the world that had looked at her and decided she wasn't good enough. Penny wanted to understand it so that one day she could walk into that world on her own 2 feet, not on the Ashford name. She didn't know that chance would come sooner than she thought, and it would come not from the bright world she was watching, but from the other side, from the shadows, from the corner table at the far end of the restaurant, on a night she had almost forgotten. That night, the restaurant was almost empty. After 11 o'clock, only 2 tables still had customers. Penny sat behind the cashier counter, checking the day's receipts, sorting the cash by denomination, then clipping it neatly together. The night shift was always like that. Slow, quiet, and she liked it. Quiet meant no one was looking at her. No one was judging her. She was only the person sitting behind the counter, finishing her work before going home. The front door opened. Her work, 3 men walked in. The man in the middle was tall, with long strides, but he wasn't in a hurry. He looked once around the restaurant, then went straight to the deepest corner table, where the light didn't fully reach. The 2 men with him didn't sit. They stood, one near the door, the other a few steps from the table, their eyes observing the entire restaurant, not the kind of hourly hired security. the kind of men whose very presence was already a warning. The server walked to the corner table faster than usual. She lowered her head a little more than necessary when she handed over the menu. The restaurant manager stepped out from the kitchen, glanced toward the corner table, then turned back inside, without saying anything. Penny observed all of it from behind the counter. She didn't know who that man was, but she recognized one thing. No one in this restaurant dared to look him directly in the eyes. Not because he acted fierce, but because there was something in the way he sat, in the way he stayed silent, that made other people lower their voices on instinct. The meal lasted about 40 minutes. The man ate slowly, didn't look at his phone, didn't talk to anyone. The two men with him stood still as statues. The restaurant gradually emptied. The final table of customers paid and left. Only the corner table remained. Then everything happened very quickly. The front door burst open. 4 men stormed in, loud voices, heavy steps, eyes sweeping across the restaurant. One of them shouted for the owner by name. "Where is he? Call him out here." 3 months. It's been 3 months. Chairs and tables were shoved out of place. A glass fell to the floor and shattered with a sharp crash. The server screamed and ran toward the kitchen. The manager disappeared too. In less than 10 seconds, the restaurant was completely empty. Only Penny remained behind the cashier counter and the corner table. The man at the corner table didn't stand. He didn't even turn his head. He set his silverware down, slowly, then lifted his eyes to the 2 men standing beside him. Just one look. No nod, no gesture, not a single word. The 2 bodyguards stepped toward the debt collectors. Penny didn't see clearly what happened because she was focused on something else. She held tightly to the cash drawer. Both her hands gripped the edge of the register drawer, her fingers clenched until they turned white. Around her, people ran, objects toppled, shouts rang through the narrow space. But Penny didn't run. Not because she was brave. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. But if she ran, no one would guard the cash drawer. The money would be gone. She would be fired. She had no other job. Mrs. Ruth would have to carry more. A simple calculation. Fear was fear, but losing the job was not allowed. The incident ended quickly. The debt collectors left. The 2 bodyguards returned to their places as if nothing had happened. The restaurant fell silent again, with only the crunch of broken glass underfoot whenever someone moved. The man at the corner table stood. He walked to the cashier counter. Penny still stood there, both hands still holding the cash drawer, her eyes fixed straight ahead. He stopped in front of the counter and looked at her. Not a look that judged her appearance, not a look of pity. The look of someone reading another person, calculating, weighing. "Everyone else ran," he said. His voice was deep, flat, as if he were stating a fact. "You stood still." Penny swallowed. Her throat was dry, but her voice still came out. "If the money is lost, I lose my job. I don't have another one to lose." He looked at her for a few more seconds. Then he turned and walked to the door. He left no name, no business card. He didn't say another word. The 2 bodyguards followed. The door closed. The restaurant was empty. Penny stood alone among the shards of broken glass and the crooked tables and chairs, her hands still gripping the cash drawer. She exhaled, slow and long, then gradually let go. Her fingers were numb from holding on too tightly for too long. She looked down and realized her hands were shaking. Outside, in the black car parked half a block from the restaurant, the man sat in the back seat. The bodyguard in front turned to look at him. "Home, sir?" Silence for a moment. "Find out about her for me." The bodyguard didn't ask which her. Didn't ask why. He only nodded and started the car. The black car pulled away from the street. Behind it, the restaurant still glowed with light but stood hollow and empty, and Penny remained behind the counter, beginning to pick up each shard of broken glass from the floor because there was no one else left to do it. 3 days after the night at the restaurant, Penny's background report lay on Knox Mercer's desk, 2 pages. Knox read it from beginning to end, without expression, without comment. When he finished, he folded it, set it aside, then called in his bodyguard. "Send an envelope to the restaurant. Give it to the night shift cashier. Don't say who it's from." The bodyguard nodded and asked nothing more. He had worked for Knox long enough to know that uninvited questions were best left unasked. The envelope reached Penny the following evening. A delivery man walked into the restaurant, asked for the night shift cashier, placed a white envelope on the counter, then left without another word. Penny looked at the envelope. White, clean, with no sender's name. She turned it over in her hands. No special mark. She opened it. Inside was a small card. On it was an address in downtown Chicago and a handwritten line in black ink. "There's a position suitable for you. Come for an interview if you want." No signature. Beneath the line were 3 bold printed words: Mercer Holdings. Penny stared at the card for a long time. She didn't know what Mercer Holdings was. She didn't know who had sent the envelope. She didn't know why a company would invite her to an interview when she hadn't applied anywhere except the places on Mrs. Ruth's list. None of it made sense, and things that made no sense were usually not free. She brought the envelope home and placed it on the table in front of Mrs. Ruth. "Someone sent this to me at the restaurant. I don't know who." "Mrs." Ruth put on her reading glasses, picked up the card, and read it. Then she set it down. "What do you have to lose?" Penny looked at her. That question didn't need an answer, because they both knew it. Penny had nothing. No degree, no savings, no connections, except Mrs. Ruth and the restaurant manager. She was working as a night shift cashier for wages, just enough to pay the rent on their studio. If this envelope was a scam, she would lose one afternoon on the bus. If it wasn't, she might have a better job. The calculation wasn't complicated, but Penny still hesitated. She left the envelope on the table for 2 weeks. Every night when she came home from work, she looked at it. Every morning when she woke up, she looked at it. She searched Mercer Holdings online, a logistics corporation with offices in downtown Chicago, a clean, professional website, and little information beyond the surface. The kind of company that looked completely ordinary from the outside, but whose ordinariness was so perfect it made a person wonder what stood behind it. On the 15th day, Penny wore the most respectable clothes she owned, took 2 buses, and went to the address on the card. The Mercer Holdings building was neither too large nor too small, set on a quiet corner that ordinary people would pass without ever looking twice. She stepped inside and told the receptionist she had an interview appointment. The receptionist looked her over from head to toe, called someone, then led her to the 3rd floor. The interview room was small, with only 1 table and 2 chairs. Penny sat down, placed her hands on her lap, and waited. She heard footsteps in the hallway, then the door opened. The person who walked in was the man from the corner table at the restaurant that night. Penny recognized him at once. The way he entered the room was exactly the way he had entered the restaurant, neither hurried nor slow, his eyes reading the entire room in 1 second before settling on the person across from him. He sat down in the chair opposite Penny, placed a folder on the table, and looked at her. "You recognize me," he said. "It wasn't a question. You were the only one who didn't run from the table that night," Penny replied. "Hard to forget." The corner of Knox's mouth lifted slightly, not enough to be called a smile, only a small, brief reaction that disappeared at once. But it was probably the closest thing to satisfaction the people around Knox had ever seen. The interview lasted no more than 20 minutes. Knox didn't ask about degrees, didn't ask about experience, didn't ask what she was good at. He asked strange questions. "What do you see when you look at a spreadsheet? If a number doesn't match, what do you do first? Are you afraid when you hold someone else's money?" Penny answered each question in an ordinary voice, without trying to impress him, without trying to sound smarter than she was. She answered exactly what she knew, and admitted what she didn't. Knox closed the folder. "Accounting department, lowest position. You start next Monday." It wasn't an offer. It wasn't, "Do you want it?" It was an announcement. Penny looked at him for a moment, then nodded. She walked out of Mercer Holdings that afternoon with the feeling that she had just stepped through a door without fully understanding where it led. But she remembered Mrs. Ruth's question. "What do you have to lose?" And the answer was still the same. Nothing. The following Monday, Penny began working at Mercer Holdings. The accounting department was on the 2nd floor, an open room with 7 desks, 1 person at each, and very little conversation. Penny was assigned the desk closest to the door, the kind of position everyone passed by and noticed, yet no one bothered to stop at. She didn't complain. She was used to being placed at the edge. During the first month, Penny worked the way she had learned from 6 months of night shift data entry. Quiet, fast, precise. She arrived 15 minutes earlier than everyone else, and left 15 minutes later. She didn't ask her coworkers anything beyond work-related matters. She didn't eat lunch with anyone. She didn't know the full name of the person sitting 2 desks away, and no one knew her full name either. Penny existed inside Mercer Holdings the same way she had existed in the Ashford mansion, silent, unnoticed, finishing her work and going home. There was only one difference. Here, she was paid. Her job was to review expense spreadsheets, reconcile invoices against the flow of money, and flag discrepancies if any appeared. Simple, repetitive work, but it demanded absolute concentration because a single wrong number could drag an entire chain of errors behind it. Penny was good at this. Not because she had studied at a prestigious school, but because her eyes were trained to find what didn't belong among thousands of things that seemed correct. At the end of her first month, one morning, Penny opened a new data file in the system and noticed something didn't match. A large sum appeared under operating expenses, but there was no invoice to reconcile it. The amount was large enough that anyone looking would notice. Too large to be an accident, yet too obvious to be real fraud. Penny stared at the number. She had 3 choices. One was to ignore it, the way she was certain the people before her in this position had ignored similar things. 2 was to report it immediately to the department manager, quickly, neatly, and be done with responsibility. 3 was to investigate it herself. Penny chose the third option. She spent 2 days tracing the origin of the amount. She compared it with other expenses in the same quarter, searching for connections, patterns, any trace that could reveal where the money came from and where it went. After 2 days, she wrote a short report, 3 pages, clearly presenting what she had found and what she hadn't. She didn't send it to the department manager. She sent it directly to Knox. At the end of the report, she wrote a single line. "I don't know whether this is an error or intentional. If it's an error, it needs to be fixed. If it's intentional, I shouldn't be seeing it." 2 days later, Penny was called up to the 5th floor, Knox's office. She knocked, stepped inside, and stood in front of his desk. Her 3-page report lay on the table, open to the last page, the line she had written underlined in red ink. Knox sat behind the desk, looking at her. The silence stretched for a few seconds before he spoke. "Aren't you afraid?" Penny stood straight. Her hands tightened slightly at her sides, but her voice remained steady. "I am, but I'm more afraid of losing my job than I am of telling the truth." Knox looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked down at the report, folded it, and set it aside. He didn't say, "Well done." Didn't say you're smart. Didn't offer any praise. He said only one thing. "Starting next Monday, you work on this floor, directly for me." Penny blinked. She wasn't sure she had heard correctly. From the lowest position in the accounting department on the 2nd floor to working directly for the head of the corporation on the 5th floor in just 1 month, that wasn't normal. She knew it wasn't normal, but she also knew Knox wasn't a man who did anything without reason. "Yes," she said. Knox nodded. The conversation was over. Penny stepped out and closed the door behind her. She walked down the stairs back to her desk on the 2nd floor, sat down, and looked at her computer screen. Around her, coworkers were still typing, still staring at spreadsheets, unaware that something had just changed. Penny didn't fully understand what had changed either. She only knew that she had sent a report that anyone else in her position would have chosen to ignore, and the man on the 5th floor had not only kept her but pulled her closer. In the world Penny had known before, telling the truth was the fastest way to be discarded. Here, it was a way to be kept. She wasn't used to that yet, but she would learn. The following Monday, Penny moved her things to the 5th floor. Her new desk was in a small office right next to Knox's. She sat down, turned on her computer, and began working. From that day on, every important number at Mercer Holdings passed through her hands before it reached anyone else. 3 months of working on the 5th floor changed the way Penny saw Mercer Holdings, not in a sudden way, not in one bright moment of awakening. It was more like the way human eyes gradually adjust to darkness, seeing a little more each day, until the things that once seemed blurred become so clear that it's impossible to pretend not to see them. During her first week on the 5th floor, Penny realized that Mercer Holdings' cash flow was more complicated than any logistics company she had ever read about online. Money came in from sources she couldn't verify, moved through many layers of subsidiaries, then disappeared into accounts she didn't have deeper access to. She noted it, but didn't think too much yet. Maybe every large company was like that. Maybe she didn't have enough experience to understand. In the third week, she came across a shipping contract with a company in the outskirts of Chicago. She looked up the company's name. No website, no real address, no registered employees. The company existed on paper, but nowhere else. Penny looked at the number on the contract, then at the corresponding money flow, then back at the company's name. She closed the file, opened another, kept working. In the second month, she discovered 3 more companies just like it. Different names, different addresses, but the same pattern. Money came in, passed through, moved out, and with every layer it crossed, the trail faded a little more. Penny wasn't a financial expert, but she had stared at spreadsheets long enough to know when the numbers were telling a different story from the one written on paper. She didn't ask anyone, didn't report it, didn't write notes, outside the system. She simply worked, and every day she understood one more small piece of a picture she wasn't sure she wanted to see whole. By the third month, Penny didn't need to fit any more pieces together. She knew Mercer Holdings wasn't only a logistics corporation. Beneath its legal surface was a system where money never moved in a straight line, and the numbers on the spreadsheets were only the edited version of a reality far more complicated. She knew. And Knox knew she knew. One afternoon, Knox called her into his office. He sat behind the desk, no documents in front of him, no files open on the screen. Just him, and the directness of his gaze when she stepped through the door. "Close the door." Penny closed it, stood before his desk. "You know," Knox said. It wasn't a question. It was like the night at the restaurant when he had said you stood still. He didn't ask. He stated a fact. End quote. Penny was silent for a moment. She weighed every word before opening her mouth, because she understood that in this room, one wrong sentence could change everything. "I know enough to understand that I shouldn't know more." Knox looked at her. A few seconds passed. Then he leaned forward, both hands resting on the desk. "You have 2 choices. Leave, and no one touches you. I guarantee it. You walk out of here, continue your life, and forget what you saw." He paused. "Or, stay. You work for me, and you don't ask what doesn't need to be asked." Penny stood straight. She didn't look down, didn't look away. She looked directly at Knox. In her mind, the calculation was already running. Not a moral calculation, not a calculation of right and wrong, a calculation of survival. If she left, she would go back to the cashier counter at the restaurant. Wages just enough to pay the rent on the studio. Mrs. Ruth, 62 years old, would still have to clean houses by the hour, her back hurting more, her knees growing stiffer. Every month, Penny watched Mrs. Ruth come home more tired than the month before, and she knew the day when the older woman could no longer work was drawing closer. When that day came, Penny would have to carry both of them on a cashier's pay. She had done the math. It wasn't enough. If she stayed, she could keep a job that paid 4 times the cashier wage. Mrs. Ruth wouldn't have to work anymore. She could rent a larger room, buy medicine for Mrs. Ruth's back, save money for sickness and hard times. She only had to avoid asking what didn't need to be asked. Only look at the spreadsheets, do the work assigned to her, and keep her mouth shut. Penny thought of Mrs. Ruth at home, maybe cooking dinner, maybe rubbing her aching back, maybe sitting there waiting for her to come home and eat. She had given up everything to follow Penny. She never asked Penny to repay her, never demanded anything, never complained. But every day she still went out to work, 62 years old, because Penny wasn't yet strong enough to support them both. "I'll stay," Penny said. 2 words. Clean. No hesitation in her voice. Though inside her mind, an entire war had just passed through. Knox nodded. A short, decisive nod, the same kind he had given after reading her 3-page report the month before. He didn't say good. Didn't say "I trust you." Didn't say anything at all. He only opened a drawer, took out a small key, and placed it on the desk. 6th floor Financial Records Archive. Starting today, you have access. Penny looked at the key. She understood what it meant. Knox wasn't only allowing her to stay, he was letting her in deeper. She was the only person outside Knox's trusted inner circle allowed to touch the financial core of Mercer Holdings. That meant he trusted her. And in Knox Mercer's world, trust wasn't something given easily. It was given through keys, through access, through things that could be measured, not through words. Penny picked up the key, slipped it into her pocket, then turned to leave. She closed the door behind her and went back to her desk. The computer screen was still glowing, the spreadsheet still open, the numbers still waiting. She sat down and continued working, just like every other day. The only difference was that from today on, she saw more, and she chose to live with what she saw. It happened on an ordinary night, the kind of night Penny would only later look back on and realize hadn't been ordinary at all. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and she was still sitting in Knox's office, reconciling a stack of financial files for the meeting the next morning. Knox wasn't there. He had left the office at 7 o'clock in the evening, but she stayed because the work wasn't finished, and she wasn't the kind of person who left things for the next day. She needed an old file to cross-check the figures. She remembered Knox mentioning it the week before, saying it was in his desk drawer. She pulled open the right drawer. It wasn't the file she needed. She pulled open the left drawer. The file was at the very bottom, but on top of it was something else. A photograph. The photograph was old, its edges yellowed, one corner slightly curled as if it had been picked up and set down many times. In it were a woman and a teenage boy. The woman was thin, her face tired, her hair tied neatly back, wearing a white shirt with a worn collar. She stood straight, looking into the camera with eyes Penny couldn't read. Not happy, not sad. Only the calmness of someone who had grown used to enduring. The teenage boy stood beside her, almost as tall as she was, his face lean and angular, his eyes looking straight ahead with a seriousness that didn't fit his age. Penny recognized those eyes. She looked into those eyes every day on the 5th floor of Mercer Holdings. She was holding the photograph when she heard the door open. Knox stepped inside. He stopped at the threshold when he saw Penny standing beside his desk, the photograph in her hand. For one very brief moment, something passed through his eyes, so quickly Penny almost didn't catch it. Then it disappeared. His face returned to normal. He walked in, closed the door, and moved toward the desk. He wasn't angry. He didn't ask why she had opened his drawer. He only looked at the photograph in her hand. "Your mother?" Penny asked. She asked before she could think whether she should, and the moment the question left her mouth, she wanted to take it back. But it was too late. Knox didn't answer right away. He sat down, his eyes still on the photograph. Then he opened his hand. Penny placed the photograph in his palm. Knox looked at it for a while, his thumb brushing lightly over the edge, then set it on the desk. "Her name was Margaret," he said. His voice was ordinary, the same voice he used when reading financial reports, with no rise or fall, no weight, no softness. But that ordinariness was what made Penny stand still, not daring to move, because she knew what Knox was about to say was not ordinary at all. "My father's family didn't accept her. They said she wasn't worthy, not capable enough, not beautiful enough, not good enough." Knox looked out the window. She endured it for 3 years, then left on her own. No one drove her out. She walked out herself because she couldn't bear the way they looked at her every day. "She took me with her." He stopped. Penny stood motionless. She worked as a laborer, 16 hours a day. No complaints, no stories, no asking anyone for help. "She raised me on money she earned herself, in a room smaller than this office." Knox looked down at the photograph on the desk. "She died when I was 14. Her body couldn't endure it." He said the final sentence in the same voice, without changing volume, without changing rhythm. But Penny noticed that Knox's thumb was pressing against the edge of the desk so hard the fingertip had gone white. That was the only reaction his body gave. The rest of him remained perfectly controlled. "She never ran away," Knox said. "She only went as far as she could, then stopped." The silence stretched. Penny didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. She didn't say, "I understand," because that would have been a lie. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," because Knox wasn't the kind of man who needed someone to apologize on behalf of the past. She only stood there, and somehow, her silence was the truest thing she could offer. Knox looked up, looked straight at Penny. For the first time since she had stepped into Mercer Holdings, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't calculation, wasn't assessment, wasn't testing. It was closer to recognition. "You remind me of her," he said. "Not because you look alike, because of the way you endure." Penny swallowed. She didn't know how to react when a man like Knox Mercer told her she reminded him of the most important person in his life. She didn't answer with words. She only pulled out the chair, sat down across from him, and turned her eyes back to the stack of files on the desk. The two of them sat in the dark office, separated by a desk, working in silence. No one said anything more. There was no need. Some things become smaller when spoken aloud. Knox turned back to his computer screen. Penny returned to reconciling the numbers. The old photograph lay on the desk between them, the thin woman and the serious-eyed teenage boy looking up from the past, into the room where her son sat beside someone who carried a wound like hers, who was silent like her, who never ran away like her. Outside the window, Chicago at night was still bright. But inside this office, the only light came from two computer screens, and the only sound was the tapping of keys. Nothing happened that night. No confession, no romantic gesture, nothing people usually tell in love stories. Only two people sitting beside each other in silence, working, and understanding each other without needing an explanation. Sometimes, that was all it took. 1 year after Penny walked into Mercer Holdings, she was no longer the girl sitting at the desk near the door on the second floor. She was the only person besides Knox with access to the core financial system. She was the one who reconciled the figures before every important meeting. She was the one Knox called into his office when he needed to check a number, instead of calling Rowan. Rowan, Knox's deputy right hand, long before Penny even knew Mercer Holdings existed. The man who had stood beside Knox through his hardest years, who had helped build the system when it had been nothing more than a few handwritten ledgers. Rowan had once been the only person Knox trusted, until Penny appeared. Penny didn't know Rowan hated her. She didn't notice because she wasn't used to noticing how other people felt about her. 20 years in the Ashford house had taught her how to exist without needing to know who liked her and who hated her. She only worked. But Rowan was different. Rowan noticed every meeting Knox invited Penny into without inviting him. Every time Knox asked Penny's opinion before asking his. Every time Knox closed the office door to speak with her and didn't call him in. Small things, but together they became something Rowan couldn't bear. He had been here 10 years. She had only been here 1. And she was sitting in the place where he used to sit. Penny discovered Rowan not because she was searching, but because the numbers found their way to her. One afternoon, while reconciling the monthly expense summary, Penny saw a small amount moving out of a Mercer Holdings subsidiary account. The amount wasn't large, small enough to disappear among hundreds of other transactions that no one would bother checking. But Penny bothered. Not because of the amount, but because it appeared regularly. Every month, the same date, the same amount, going to the same account. She didn't report it immediately. This time, she didn't write a 3-page report and send it straight to Knox the way she had the first time. She had been at Mercer Holdings long enough to know that a regular outgoing payment wasn't a system error. Someone was intentionally moving money out, and she needed to know who. She traced the destination account, a personal account, with the owner's name hidden behind a layer of shell companies. Penny was used to these layers now. She followed them one by one, patiently, until she found the name at the end. Sterling Ashford. Penny sat in front of the screen, staring at that name, Claudia's son. He was receiving money from Mercer Holdings every month. But Sterling had no connection to Mercer. He wasn't a partner, wasn't a client, wasn't anyone in the system. So who inside Mercer was sending him money? And what was he providing in return? Penny checked the access permissions. The money had been approved from a subsidiary account that only 4 people could operate. Knox, Penny, the chief accountant, and Rowan. Penny ruled herself out. Ruled Knox out because he didn't need to hide from anyone. Ruled out the chief accountant because she had been on leave in the exact month the first payment was made, yet the money still went out. That left Rowan. Penny brought the evidence to Knox. Not a long report, only a spreadsheet open on her laptop, with the money trail highlighted, the destination account traced, and the access permissions narrowed down. She placed the laptop on Knox's desk, turned the screen toward him, and said nothing. She let the numbers speak for themselves. Knox looked at the screen. His eyes moved from top to bottom, slowly, carefully. His face didn't change. No surprise, no anger, no disappointment. Either he hid all of it, or he had suspected it before and was now only looking at confirmation. He picked up the phone. Call Rowan up. Rowan walked into Knox's office 5 minutes later. He saw Penny standing beside the desk, saw the laptop open, and understood. His face changed for a split second, from normal to pale, then hard, like a man trying to keep a mask over a face that was cracking underneath. Knox looked at Rowan. The The two men had been together for 10 years, had built this empire together, had trusted each other in situations where trust could mean life or death. 10 years folded into the distance between the office door and the desk. Knox said only 2 words. "I know." Rowan stood still. He didn't explain, didn't apologize, didn't beg, perhaps because he knew that in this world, explanations didn't change anything. He turned and walked out of the room. The next day, Rowan's desk was empty. His personal belongings had been cleared. His computer had been taken back. No one at Mercer Holdings asked where Rowan had gone. No one asked why. He left the organization the same way he had entered it, silently, leaving no trace. But Rowan left behind one thing he couldn't take back. Information. Sterling Ashford now knew where Penny was, knew what she did, knew who she worked for. During the months, Rowan had taken money from Sterling. He had provided enough information for Sterling to know that the stepsister he had once glanced past in the hallway of the Ashford mansion was now sitting on the 5th floor of one of the most powerful underworld organizations in Chicago, Penny told Knox. "Sterling knows I'm here." Knox looked at her, calmly. "Sterling knows you're here, but he doesn't know who he's playing with." Penny looked at him. She wanted to believe that sentence. She wanted to believe that Sterling knowing about her changed nothing. But inside her, something tightened. Not fear. The familiar feeling of someone who had once been abandoned by her own family, and now knew that family still hadn't let go. She went back to her desk, opened the spreadsheet, continued. Because that was the only thing she knew how to do when everything around her began to shift. Rowan left. But what he left behind wasn't only the information leaked to Sterling. In the final months before he was discovered, Rowan had deliberately altered Mercer Holdings' books in the sections related to international partners, not major changes. Only small discrepancies, just enough so that when the partners checked again, they would see that the numbers didn't match. Enough for them to begin doubting. 3 weeks after Rowan left, the call came from New York. The international partner, the group that had invested nearly 40% of Mercer Holdings' total operating assets, announced that they were considering withdrawing their capital. The reason was unclear books. They demanded an in-person presentation in New York within 72 hours, or they would begin the capital withdrawal process. Knox sat in his office, read the email, then set his phone down on the desk. Losing 40% of the operating assets meant Mercer Holdings would shrink back to the size Knox had spent 10 years outgrowing. He needed someone to fly to New York, sit in front of the partners, and present the entire financial system with enough transparency and persuasion to make them change their minds. He couldn't go himself. Appearing in person before an international investment group with its own legal team meant that the identity and true nature of Mercer Holdings risked being examined under a light Knox never wanted to stand in. Penny knocked on Knox's office door that afternoon. "I heard about the call from New York," she said. Knox looked at her. "Who told you?" "No one. I saw the email in the system. I have access, remember?" Knox was silent. "Let me go," Penny said. "Are you sure?" "No. But no one else can do it." Knox looked at her for a long time. She stood before his desk, her back straight, her eyes steady, exactly like the first day she had walked into the interview room. The only difference was that now she wasn't the night shift cashier anymore. She was the person who knew Mercer Holdings' financial system better than anyone except Knox. And she was right. No one else could do it. "The plane will be ready tonight," Knox said. "I'll upload every document you need to the system within 2 hours." Penny nodded. She turned away, called Mrs. Ruth to tell her she would be away on business for a few days, then went back to the studio to pack. That night, she boarded Mercer Holdings' private plane at a small airport south of Chicago, alone. The next 72 hours were the longest 72 hours of Penny's life. She reached New York close to midnight, checked into the hotel, opened her laptop, and began working. She rebuilt the entire financial report from the beginning, peeled apart every layer of discrepancy Rowan had left behind, replaced them with real figures, and wrote explanations for every item the partners had marked as questionable. She didn't sleep the first night. On the second night, she dozed for 2 hours in the chair, her laptop still open on her lap, then woke with a start and kept working. On the morning of the third day, she stood in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a financial building in the middle of Manhattan. Across from her were 4 people, cold-faced, pens in hand, and in front of each one lay the stack of documents she had sent the night before. Penny stood alone. No Knox behind her. No one behind her. Only her report, and everything she had learned over the past 2 years. She presented for 45 minutes. No trembling, no stumbling, not one unnecessary word. She read each number the way she did every day on the 5th floor of Mercer Holdings, clearly, precisely, and with a calm so steady that the people across from her gradually leaned forward instead of leaning back. The meeting ended. The partners kept their capital in place. Penny stepped out of the building and stood on the Manhattan sidewalk at midday, slightly unsteady from 72 hours, without enough sleep. She took out her phone and called Knox. "They're staying." Silence on the other end. 1, 2, 3 seconds. "Come home." 2 words. The way Knox always spoke, clean, with nothing wasted. But Penny heard something in those 2 words that she had never heard before. Not an order. Something closer to relief. Penny flew back to Chicago that evening. When the plane landed at the private airport, she looked through the window and saw a black car parked near the runway. Not the bodyguard's car. Knox was sitting behind the wheel. She stepped off the plane, opened the car door, and sat in the passenger seat. She didn't ask why he was driving himself, didn't ask where the bodyguard was. She sat down, leaned her head against the seat, and fell asleep, immediately, like someone who had kept herself awake by sheer will for 3 days. And now, sitting in this seat, that will had finally let go. Knox looked at her for a moment. Then he started the car and drove out of the airport. The bodyguard's car followed behind, keeping its distance. Knox drove onto the highway, merging into the stream of Chicago traffic at night. He drove slowly, slower than usual. Slower even than he drove when he wasn't in a hurry. Not because the road was crowded, not because he was tired, but because the person sitting beside him was asleep, and he didn't want to wake her. Knox Mercer, the man no one in Chicago's underworld dared to look directly in the eye, was driving slowly down the highway in the middle of the night so a girl could sleep a few minutes longer. He said nothing, did nothing, only drove. And if anyone asked him why, he wouldn't answer. Because Knox wasn't the kind of man who explained what he did. He only did it. In the car behind them, the bodyguard looked at the speed of the car ahead displayed on the tracking screen. Unusually slow. He made no comment. He had worked for Knox long enough to know that there were things one saw but shouldn't mention. The black car moved slowly through Chicago at night. Penny slept. Knox drove. And the distance between the 2 of them in that car suddenly felt shorter than any distance before it, though neither touched the other, and neither said a word. 3 years after the night Penny walked out through the gates of the Ashford mansion, her life had changed so much that if Harold saw her now, he wouldn't recognize her. Not because her appearance was different. She was still Penny, still with a round face, still with short hands. But the way she walked into a meeting room, the way she opened her laptop, the way she read figures in a voice that didn't shake, that was a completely different person. The person Harold had never given her the chance to become. And Harold was about to see that person, though he didn't know it yet. It began with a call Knox received. On a Tuesday morning, one of the lending groups Knox controlled on Chicago's west side reported that a large debt was 3 months overdue. The borrower had promised to pay many times but had never followed through. The lending group wanted instructions from Knox before proceeding to the next step. Knox asked them to send up the file. He opened it, read the borrower's name, and stopped. Sterling Ashford, Guarantor Company, Ashford Holdings. Knox closed the file, sat still for a while. Then he opened it again and read more carefully. Sterling had borrowed a large sum to invest in a real estate project that anyone with experience would have recognized as high risk. The project failed. The money was gone. Sterling had no ability to repay. Ashford Holdings was bleeding financially, and Harold, the man behind the company, perhaps didn't even know who his son had borrowed money from. Knox picked up the phone. Arrange an official debt recovery negotiation. The meeting room at the restaurant on the 12th floor. Invite Mr. Harold Ashford. He paused. And assign this case file to Penny. He didn't call Penny in beforehand, didn't mention it, didn't explain. He only assigned the file into the system like any other case, letting it sit on her work list, waiting for her to open it herself. Penny opened the file that afternoon. She saw the words Ashford Holdings on the first page, and her hands stopped on the keyboard. Her heart missed a beat. She read it again. Ashford Holdings. Harold Ashford. Sterling Ashford. The names she had spent the past 2.5 years trying to push out of her mind now lay neatly inside a debt recovery file on her computer screen. She closed the laptop, stood, walked straight to Knox's office. She opened the door without knocking. Knox looked up from his desk, looked at her, and knew at once what she had seen. "You knew from the beginning?" Penny asked. Her voice was flat, but her eyes weren't. "I knew. Why didn't you tell me first?" Knox set down his pen, looked at her. "Because if I had, you would have refused, and you deserve to sit on that side of the table." Penny stood before his desk, drew in a long breath, then let it out slowly. She was angry. Angry that Knox had decided for her. Angry that he knew her family story, knew her background, knew she had been driven out, knew she had been treated as unworthy, and used all of that to arrange a meeting she'd had no chance to prepare for. But at the same time, she understood. She understood that if Knox had called her in last week and said, "Your father owes me money, and you'll be handling the case," she would have said no. She would have found every reason not to sit across from Harold Ashford. Not because she was weak, but because facing the person who once abandoned you is always harder than facing a stranger, no matter how strong you've become. Knox was right. And she hated that he was right. "When is the meeting?" she asked. "The day after tomorrow." Penny nodded, then turned and left. She said nothing more. That evening, Penny went back to the studio. Mrs. Ruth was sitting at the small kitchen table, peeling an orange and watching the news on her old phone. Penny sat down across from her in silence. "Mrs." Ruth looked at her, set the orange down, and waited. "I'm going to see my father again," Penny said. Mrs. Ruth didn't ask why, didn't ask where, didn't ask how. She only looked at Penny. "Are you afraid?" Penny thought for a while. "I don't know." Mrs. Ruth nodded. She understood that kind of, "I don't know." It didn't mean not knowing whether one was afraid. It meant fear mixed with anger, pain, and something nameless, all tangled together until it was impossible to separate them and call each one by name. The two of them sat silently for a while. Mrs. Ruth finished peeling the orange, split it in half, and placed one half in front of Penny. Then she said, her voice ordinary, as if she were speaking about the weather, "You don't need to prove anything to him. You only need to prove it to yourself." Penny looked at the half orange in front of her. Then she picked it up and ate it. Sour, but she swallowed all of it. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Mrs. Ruth's steady breathing in the bed beside hers. Tomorrow, she would sit across from Harold Ashford for the first time in 2.5 years. He would see her, and this time, she wouldn't be the one pushed out of the family photo. She would be the one holding the pen that marked the debt. The meeting room was on the 12th floor of an upscale restaurant Knox owned in downtown Chicago. A private room, one long table, 6 chairs, windows looking out over the city skyline. Harold Ashford arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly on time. He entered with a lawyer, both men in suits, but on Harold, the suit no longer fit the way it had 2.5 years ago. He was thinner. His hair was grayer. His eyes carried the dark circles of a man who hadn't slept enough in months. He sat down, placed his briefcase on the table, and looked toward the door, waiting for the representative from the other side to arrive. The door opened. Penny walked in. She wore a black suit, her hair tied neatly back, her right hand holding a laptop, her left hand holding a stack of documents. She didn't look at Harold as she entered. She looked at the chair across from him, pulled it out, sat down, placed the laptop on the table, opened it, and turned on the screen. Every movement was precise, practiced, neither too much nor too little, like someone who had done this hundreds of times. Harold looked at her. At first, he didn't recognize her. He saw a young, professional woman entering the room, with the bearing of someone in control of the meeting. Not the kind of person he had expected from a lending organization. He looked more closely, the round face, the short hands, short fingers resting on the laptop keyboard. Those hands. He knew those hands. He had seen those hands for 26 years before they walked out the door of his house. Harold's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The lawyer beside him looked at him, frowning, not understanding what was happening. Penny didn't look up. She opened a file on the laptop, angled the screen slightly so both Harold and the lawyer could see it, then began speaking. Ashford Holdings is currently carrying a total debt, including principal and interest, that has been overdue for 3 months. The loan was signed by Sterling Ashford in his capacity as investment director, with Ashford Holdings as guarantor. Her voice was even. Not cold, not warm, simply professional. Like a news anchor reading the news, every word clear, every word exact, with no personal emotion slipping in. The loan was used to invest in a commercial real estate project on the west side of Chicago. The project failed after 4 months. The entire investment capital was lost. In addition, during the financial review of Ashford Holdings, I discovered that Sterling Ashford had made multiple withdrawals from company accounts into his personal accounts over the past 18 months. Penny clicked the mouse and moved to the next spreadsheet. Each line, each number, each date, each withdrawal. She read them all. No omissions, no emphasis. Harold wasn't listening. He could no longer hear anything after realizing who was sitting across from him. His eyes were on Penny, but he didn't see the laptop, didn't see the spreadsheet, didn't see the numbers. He saw the daughter he had once told, "You don't fit this family," sitting on the opposite side of the negotiation table, representing the party that now held his financial fate. He saw the daughter he hadn't allowed into the family photograph reading out each piece of evidence proving the failure of the son he had chosen over her. He saw those round hands, those short fingers, turning each page of the documents with a confidence he had never given her the chance to build. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. Penny finished the presentation, laid out the debt recovery plan, and asked Ashford's lawyer to sign confirmation of the repayment schedule. The lawyer looked to Harold, waiting for instruction. Harold nodded mechanically, not looking at the documents. He signed whatever was placed before him because his mind was no longer inside this meeting. Penny closed the laptop, gathered the stack of documents, stood. "Thank you for coming. We'll contact you when needed." She turned and walked toward the door. Her steps were even, her back straight, and she didn't look back. Harold stood, his chair dragged backward with a harsh scrape against the floor. The lawyer looked at him in surprise. Harold didn't notice. He walked quickly to the door, into the hallway, and saw Penny heading toward the elevator. "Penny!" She stopped. She didn't turn around. Her back remained straight. Both hands still held the laptop and documents. Harold took a few more steps toward her. His voice trembled, and for the first time in Penny's life, she heard her father speak with a shaking voice. "Daughter." Penny stood still for 1 second. Then she turned her head just enough for Harold to see part of her face. No anger, no sadness, no hatred. Only a calmness Harold recognized at once, because it was the calmness of someone who had stopped expecting anything from him a very long time ago. "Mr. Ashford," Penny said, "we're in a meeting." Then she stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Harold stood alone in the hallway. The lawyer stepped out behind him, hesitant, unsure whether he should ask. He didn't. Harold stood there, staring at the closed elevator doors, and understood something he wished he didn't understand. Penny didn't hate him. She wasn't angry with him. She didn't resent him. She had forgotten him. And of all the things Harold Ashford had ever feared in his life, being forgotten by his daughter was something he had never thought of. He had prepared for anger, for tears, for resentment, for shouting. He had prepared for everything except indifference. And that indifference didn't cut like a knife. It was heavier. It was like walking into a room where you had once lived and discovering that the walls had been repainted, all the furniture replaced, and there was no trace left to prove you had ever been there. Harold returned to the meeting room, sat down in his chair, looked at the place where Penny had just been sitting. The chair was still slightly warm, but the person was already gone, and he knew he had no right to call her back. After the negotiation, the work should have been done. Penny had presented, Harold had signed, and the repayment schedule had been established. She could have closed the Ashford Holdings file and moved on to the next case. But Knox asked her to analyze Ashford's financial situation more deeply, to assess its real ability to repay the debt, because if Ashford Holdings went bankrupt before paying in full, Mercer Holdings would lose money. That was the professional reason. Reasonable. Unrelated to emotion, Penny reopened the entire financial file for Ashford Holdings. She started with the income and expense reports from the past 3 years, then traced backward. She looked for Sterling's unusual expenses to assess the real extent of the damage he had caused the company. She already knew about the money Sterling had withdrawn from Ashford Holdings, had already presented it in the meeting. But when she expanded the scope to personal accounts connected to the Ashford family, she saw something she hadn't been looking for. A recurring payment from Claudia's personal account. Not large, but regular, once every quarter, lasting more than 10 years. The recipient was a private medical laboratory in the suburbs of Chicago. That same account also paid a lawyer who specialized in family legal documents, also regularly, also during the same period. Penny looked at those two payment lines. A medical laboratory, a family legal paperwork lawyer, regularly, every quarter, for more than 10 years. Starting before Claudia married Harold. She didn't understand right away. Or perhaps she understood but didn't want to believe it. She printed the 2 pages of data, folded them, put them in her pocket, and went home. Mrs. Ruth was sitting at the kitchen table when Penny walked in. Penny placed the 2 pages in front of her. Mrs. Ruth put on her glasses, read slowly, then set the papers down. She said nothing for a long while. "I always suspected it," Mrs. Ruth said. Her voice was slow, heavy, as if these words had been sitting in her throat for a very long time and were only now being spoken. Sterling didn't have a single feature like Mr. Harold's. Different eyes, different nose, different chin. I watched that boy grow up in the Ashford house for more than 10 years, and I never saw one trace of Mr. Harold on his face, but I was the housekeeper. I had no proof, and no one asked my opinion. Penny sat down. "You think Sterling isn't my father's biological son?" "I think Claudia hid something before she ever stepped into the Ashford house, and she paid someone to keep that secret for all those years." Penny returned to Mercer Holdings that night. She sat alone at the computer on the 5th floor and began digging. Not in Mercer's system this time. She used the access to Ashford's financial records that Knox had assigned her, following the money Claudia had paid to the laboratory. She found the laboratory's name, found the service records, found the type of test Claudia had requested. A paternity test. Then she found the payments to the lawyer. She traced the lawyer's records and found the type of paperwork he had handled for Claudia. Adoption papers. But in Ashford Holdings files, Sterling was recorded as Harold's biological son, not an adopted child. Sterling's birth certificate clearly listed Harold Ashford as his father. Penny sat in front of the screen, looking at the 2 records side by side. On one side were the adoption papers the lawyer had handled for Claudia. On the other was the birth certificate stating that Sterling was Harold's biological son. The 2 documents contradicted each other, and there was only one explanation. Claudia had falsified it. She had turned adoption papers into a birth certificate, making Harold believe Sterling was his blood, giving Sterling inheritance rights, securing her own place in the Ashford family. Harold had driven his biological daughter out of the house to keep a child who wasn't his, and he had no idea. But Penny hadn't even had time to absorb all of that when she found something else. In Sterling's personal cash flow, there was a small payment sent to that same laboratory, once, 10 years earlier. When Sterling was 18, he had gone for a paternity test himself. He had checked for himself, and he had known the result. Sterling had known he wasn't Harold's biological son since he was 18. 10 years. He had known for 10 years. He knew, Claudia knew, and both of them kept the secret, continued living in Harold's house, continued spending Harold's money, continued pushing Penny aside to hold their own place. Sterling wasn't an innocent child used by his mother. He was an accomplice for 10 years. Penny sat in front of the screen. Both hands rested on the keyboard, but she didn't type. She looked at the numbers, the dates, the lines of money sitting neatly on the screen, and she felt her hands tremble. Not from fear, from anger, the kind of anger she wasn't used to because she had spent her whole life not being angry, accepting, staying silent, stepping over everything without making noise. But this time was different. This time, she was looking at clear proof that her life had been stolen by 2 people who knew exactly what they were doing. Claudia knew Sterling wasn't Harold's son. Sterling knew he wasn't Harold's son. But both of them chose silence, chose performance, chose to let Harold keep loving the wrong person and rejecting the right one. And the price of that performance was Penny. 26 years of Penny being treated as not good enough, not beautiful enough, not worthy enough, until she was driven out of the house with one suitcase and an old housekeeper. Penny didn't scream, didn't slam the desk, didn't cry. She only sat there, her hands trembling on the keyboard, eyes fixed on the screen, and silent. Because she had learned long ago that silence could sometimes be stronger than any shout, and because she was thinking about what she would do with this truth, keep it or send it away. Penny took 3 days to decide. For 3 days, she went to work as usual, sat in front of her computer as usual, reconciled numbers as usual. But there was only one question in her mind: send it or keep it. If she kept it, she would protect herself, stay away from the Ashford family, continue living her life, and let Harold sink with his false son and deceitful wife. If she sent it, she would give Harold the truth he deserved to know, even though he had once been unworthy of her. Keeping it was reason. Sending it was something deeper than reason, something Penny couldn't name, but it lived somewhere between justice and the final time she allowed herself to care. On the 4th day, Penny printed the entire file. The money trail showing Claudia's payments to the laboratory, the money paid to the lawyer, the original adoption papers, the falsified birth certificate, the paternity test Sterling had taken himself when he was 18. Everything, from the first page to the last, neat, clear, without a single piece of evidence missing. She put it all into a large envelope, sealed it, wrote the Ashford mansion's address on the front. Then she took a small piece of paper and wrote by hand. Father deserves to know the truth. This is the last time I'll do anything for this family. She slipped the note into the envelope, went to the post office, and sent it. The envelope reached Harold Ashford 3 days later. He opened it in his study, alone, in the evening. He read the handwritten note first. Penny's handwriting. He recognized it at once because her handwriting looked like her mother's, slanted, small, perfectly even. Then he opened the stack of documents behind it. Harold read from the first page to the last. With every page he read, his face changed. From confusion to shock. From shock to disbelief. From disbelief to certainty. And from certainty to anger. Not the silent kind of anger from the meeting room the week before. This time Harold stood, the stack of documents trembling in his hands, his face red, and he called Claudia down to the study immediately. Penny didn't witness what happened inside the Ashford mansion that night, and she didn't need to. She only learned the result through a call from Mrs. Ruth 2 days later. Mrs. Ruth had kept in touch with an old housekeeper who still worked around the Ashford property. Claudia and Sterling had left the mansion. Harold had called lawyers in that very night. The inheritance papers had been revoked. Sterling's name had been removed from every company account. Claudia dragged her suitcase out the door at 2 o'clock in the morning, Sterling walking behind her, his face hard as stone. Harold stood at the door watching them leave, the same way he had once stood in his study watching Penny leave, but this time he didn't look away. This time he looked straight at them. And this time he didn't keep anyone back, because he knew the people walking out that door had never truly belonged to him. But Sterling wasn't the kind of person who accepted losing everything in silence. 2 weeks after being driven out of the Ashford house, he began striking back. Using the information Rowan had sold him before, Sterling spread rumors on social media and sent messages to several reporters claiming that Penny Ashford was working for an underworld business organization in Chicago. He didn't have concrete evidence, only fragments of information Rowan had provided, but it was enough to raise suspicion, enough to damage Penny's reputation if she ever stepped beyond the underworld and into the legitimate business world. Knox learned about it on the very first day. He didn't tell Penny. He handled it himself. That evening, Knox went to a bar on Chicago's North Side, where Sterling often spent time. He entered alone, with no bodyguard, no entourage. He sat down in the chair across from Sterling at the corner table. Sterling was drinking. He looked up, saw Knox, and his hand stiffened around the glass. Knox didn't greet him, didn't introduce himself. He only looked at Sterling and asked, "Do you know who I am?" Sterling set the glass down. "I know who you are. Then you also know I don't come to talk twice." Knox spoke slowly, each word clear, his voice neither rising nor falling. "Her name shouldn't appear anywhere again. Not online. Not in the papers. Not in any conversation of yours. If I hear her name coming from you one more time, I won't come here to talk. Knox didn't say what he would do. He didn't need to. That sentence wasn't a threat. It was a notice. And Sterling, no matter how arrogant, no matter how angry, was still smart enough to look into Knox Mercer's eyes and understand that the man sitting in front of him wasn't joking. He never joked. Sterling stayed silent. Knox stood and left. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. From that day on, Penny's name no longer appeared anywhere. Every post was taken down. Every reporter stopped digging. Sterling went silent as if he had never existed. That evening, when Knox returned, Penny was sitting at her desk on the 5th floor. She watched him walk in, his coat still on, his eyes calm as if he had merely gone out for dinner. "Where did you go?" she asked. "Talked to Sterling." Penny looked at him. "What did you do to him?" "Talked." "Just talked?" Knox sat down, turned on his computer, and opened the unfinished file. He didn't look up. "With me, that's enough." Penny watched him a moment longer. Then she turned back to her own screen. She asked nothing more, because she understood that in Knox Mercer's world, talking carried a different weight than it did in the rest of the world. And she understood something else, too. Something she didn't say aloud, that Knox had just done for her what no one else ever had. He protected her, not because she was weak, but because she was his. And Knox Mercer didn't let anyone touch what was his. Harold didn't come to find Penny. Maybe he understood that after everything that had happened, he had no right to appear in front of her and demand to be heard. Maybe he remembered the way she had called him, Mr. Ashford, in the meeting room, and he understood that door had already closed, at least in the way he had once known it. But he did something else. He wrote a letter. End quote. End quote. The letter reached Mrs. Ruth on a Saturday morning through the mail, a white envelope, handwritten address. Mrs. Ruth looked at the handwriting, recognized it at once, then set it on the kitchen table and waited for Penny to come home. Penny returned that afternoon, saw the envelope, looked at Mrs. Ruth, then looked back at the envelope. Mrs. Ruth said nothing, only gave a slight nod. Penny sat down, opened it, and began to read. The letter didn't begin with "I'm sorry." It didn't begin with "Please forgive me." There was no pleading in it. It began with a name. Penny's mother's name. Harold wrote about her. Things Claudia had never allowed to be spoken inside the Ashford house. He wrote that her mother liked strawberry ice cream in the summer and always bought 2 bars, one for herself and one for Penny, even though Penny had been only 4 and couldn't finish one. He wrote that her mother laughed loudly, the kind of laugh that filled a room, and she was never embarrassed by it. He wrote that her mother made the best chicken porridge he had ever eaten, and whenever he was sick, she cooked it, sat by his bed, and made him finish the bowl before letting him lie down again. He wrote that before going to sleep, her mother always said one thing to Penny. "Sleep well. Tomorrow I'll still be here." Penny stopped when she reached that sentence. She set the letter down on the table. She looked out the window. Then she cried. She didn't cry because of Harold. She cried because of her mother. Because for 20 years she had lived in the Ashford house, and no one had ever told her what her mother liked, how she laughed, what she cooked. 20 years growing up with a space shaped like a mother that no one filled, because Claudia erased every trace of her, and Harold let Claudia erase it. The letter didn't give Penny those 20 years back, but it gave her small pieces she had never had. And those small pieces hurt, but they were precious. Penny didn't reply to the letter. She folded it, placed it in a drawer, and continued living. 3 months later, one evening, Penny sat in the studio apartment, looking at the drawer where the letter lay, then took out her phone. She dialed Harold's number. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. His voice was hoarse, slow, like someone no longer used to receiving calls. "I'm not calling you," Penny said the moment he picked up. "I'm calling because I want to know about my mother." Harold was silent on the other end, for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Anything I tell you, you want to hear? Everything. From the beginning," Harold told her. He told her about the first day he met her mother, about the small wedding with only 20 guests, about the day Penny was born and her mother held her for 6 hours without letting go, about the afternoons her mother sat on the back steps and sang to Penny, even though she didn't sing well. He told her about her smile, about her voice, about everything he had tried to forget for 20 years because Claudia had forced him to forget, and now he realized that forgetting someone you loved wasn't strength, it was cowardice. The call lasted more than 2 hours. the longest since Penny had been a child. When it ended, Penny said, "Once a month, you tell me about my mother, that's all. Don't expect anything more." Harold was silent. Then he said, "All right." Penny hung up. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a severing either. It was a narrow opening, just enough for light to pass through, but not enough to step across. 6 months after that call, Mrs. Ruth fell ill. Not serious enough to be life-threatening, but enough that she couldn't move around comfortably anymore. Penny wanted to move her into a larger place, hire a caregiver, buy the best medicine, but Mrs. Ruth shook her head. "I want to go home." Home for Mrs. Ruth wasn't the Ashford mansion. It wasn't any other house. Her home was the small studio on the south side, the first place the two of them had rented after leaving the shelter, where the bed stood 3 steps from the gas stove and the window faced a brick wall. She called it home because it was the first place she had lived by her own choice. Penny took Mrs. Ruth back to the studio. She cleaned, changed the bedsheets, added pillows so she could rest more comfortably. Mrs. Ruth lay on the bed, looking up at the familiar ceiling, then turned to Penny sitting beside her. "You look so much like your mother," she said. Penny looked at her. "You say that all the time." "Because it's always true." Mrs. Ruth looked at her, her eyes wet, but she didn't cry. Mrs. Ruth wasn't the kind of person who cried. She only looked at Penny longer than usual, as if she were seeing 2 people at once, the daughter sitting in front of her, and the mother who had been gone for 20 years, and she saw them overlap perfectly. Every feature, every posture, every silence. Mrs. Ruth glanced toward the door. Knox stood there, leaning against the frame, arms crossed, not stepping inside. He had been there for some time. Penny didn't know how long, but he stood still, didn't knock, didn't speak, because he understood that this room wasn't his. This was Penny and Mrs. Ruth's space. He didn't belong here, but he was there. Mrs. Ruth looked at Knox, then back at Penny. "That boy stands at the door like a guard dog." Penny laughed. A short, unexpected laugh that escaped before she could hold it back. The first time in a long while, she had laughed without needing a reason. "Mrs." Ruth looked toward the door a moment longer, then spoke more softly. "But he's good. I can see it." Penny said nothing. She held Mrs. Ruth's hand, and Mrs. Ruth held hers. 2 hands, one old, one young, holding on to each other in the small room that 3 years earlier had been their first shelter when the whole world turned its back. Penny looked out the window, the same window where 3 years ago she had sat and cried after being driven out of her home. Outside, it was still the same brick wall, the same pale yellow streetlight, the same distant sound of traffic. Nothing had changed outside, but inside was different. This time, Penny didn't cry. Not because the pain was gone, but because she was strong enough to carry it with her. If this story touched you, please press like and share so more people can hear it. Please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories. How do you feel about Penny's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. We always want to hear the most honest feelings from your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye and see you in the next video.